on to help us out with that. All right, I'm very pleased to present our next speaker, Jim Hoyk, who was the former director of the Alta Regional Center, which is Sacramento-ish area, and is now a private consultant. He is extremely knowledgeable. We're very, 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 very grateful to have him here today. So without any further ado, Jim.
Thank you. First of all, let me give you a little bit of my background. I have been in the field for, I hate to say, I think it's 35 years now, working with folks with disabilities. I've been fortunate to have worked in a lot of the agencies that we want to connect our family members to, our disabled family members to. I started my career as a State Department of Rehabilitation counselor, and my caseload was regional center clients. I then was recruited over to, Frank Lanterman wrote another law. We're going to talk about the Lanterman Act as it relates to developmental disabilities, but Frank Lanterman wrote another law that provided educational services and supports to disabled individuals in the community colleges. And so I was recruited over to the San Diego Community College District and became Associate Dean of Special Education there, and again building programs for what was called limited learners in those days. Then got recruited to the Chancellor's Office in Sacramento to start the statewide foundation for community colleges, and we set up a lot of high-tech centers at the 106 community colleges that help people with disabilities access education. Whether it was through special software, we had agreements with Apple and with IBM. Then the opportunity came to become executive director of a regional center, and I was recruited for that position. Was there for 10 years, and as Jill said, it was the Alta California Regional Center, which served the Sacramento County and the nine surrounding counties. We served about 13,000 people. I had a budget of about $125 million, about 300 people, and we were to provide services to 13,000 people, which becomes the crunch, the amount of money given and the amount of services that are needed. Was there for 10 years, retired, and now have been busier than ever for the last 11 years working with families, most of which have special needs trusts, either first party or third party, which you'll hear more about as to what that means, but also just helping a lot of families navigate through all the various public benefits. So today, well, also I want to add that I had obviously the personal experience. My wife's brother was a consumer of the San Diego Regional Center, so have been on the other side of the table, which was always sort of fun when Chuck had his IPP meetings at the regional center, and they, you know, the San Diego Center saw an executive director of a regional center sitting across the table. But I always enjoy that. So anyway, let's talk about the regional center system. I know we had talked, it touched on a lot of other benefits, and I give a lot of presentations on all of the various public benefits, whether it be SSI, SSDI, IHSS, Medi-Cal, but today is going to be just the regional center system. Okay, so let's see if I can get this thing to work. Regional centers, a little bit of history. Regional centers were created back in the 60s. They bear the name of Lanterman. Frank Lanterman was a Republican legislator. We don't usually think of the Republicans developing a lot of social service programs, but it was originally 2 regional centers were set up, one in San Francisco, one in Los Angeles. They were only to serve folks with mental retardation, which was the term in those days. And as has been referred to so much today, it was a result of parental advocacy. The parents of the individuals, family members who were in the state institutions with the big I, were saying there's got to be a better way. We've got to be able to serve our family members out in the community. And they would literally, these families would literally get in the elevator with Frank Lanterman in the Senator, it used to be called the Senator Office Building, now it was the Senator Hotel, and would follow him up to his office and pound on, the parents wouldn't pound on the table saying there's got to be some better way of serving our family members in the community. So that's what created the initial regional centers in 2 different pilot areas. Fast forward, we have 21 regional centers now serving thousands of people. Budgets for $3 to $4 billion is spent in regional centers. If you ever tried to set up a program now with that type of money, it would not be done. As has been alluded to, California is one of the few states that has an entitlement, and we'll talk a little bit more about what does that really mean, what is the entitlement. But the regional centers came into existence because of the advocacy that parents provided to get it done. In fact, apparently Frank Lanterman was the chair of the finance committee too, and basically had held hostage the state budget until Reagan agreed that he was going to sign that regional center act. So that was pretty cool. Okay, regional centers, people usually think that they're governmental agencies. They're not. They're private nonprofit corporations. They're 501c3s. They're run by local boards of directors, which is sort of interesting because usually boards of directors set policy, but the policies are written in the Lanterman Act. But there is differences between regional centers. Regional centers were intentionally not set up as state agencies because, I hope there's no state employees in the room, Frank Lanterman and the creators of it said it was too important a job to leave to the state to do, so they wanted to do it through private nonprofit corporations. And so that's how it came about. Now, those private nonprofit corporations, they contract with the state of California. The overall agency is the Department of Developmental Services. They are the funding source. That's the mothership who provides the funding to the regional centers. But those local boards are important, and those are boards that you can get on. Your local regional centers are required to have parent participation. They're required to have a certain ratio of parents that represent the disabilities that the regional center serves. They're also required to have actual consumers on those boards. So it's a good way to get involved. There's many subcommittees, vendor committees, and consumer committees that come out of those boards that it would be good for you to become involved in. Again, the regional centers contract with Department of Developmental Services. And regional centers don't provide direct service. A lot of people don't realize that. The only service that they provide is assessment, identifying the cases, finding them eligible, and then doing case management. But all the services that the regional center provides is through the funding of vendors, a vendor community, of vendors in various categories who have agreed to accept the rate that the regional center is going to pay, which is, I think Steve had alluded to. Those rates are not keeping up with what is necessary to be able to pay the actual worker who's providing the service to your family member a wage that will keep them in that job and will attract people with good qualifications and experience. But those are the vendors that the regional center pays to actually get the service done. So sometimes, I mean, like residential, sometimes I think parents think that the regional center can just place somebody into a residential facility. They don't run the residential facilities. They do run the state institutions still with the big I, but the Department of Developmental Services does, not the regional centers. But regional centers do all of their services through vendors. The philosophy, of course, behind regional centers is that they are to allow children with developmental disabilities to remain with their families, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and for adults to achieve the highest level of normalization. Again, 21 regional centers, more than 40 offices. And getting back to that first dot, many of the services that you'll discuss in the IPP with the regional center worker, I many times will use the leverage of saying, you know, that service needs to be provided in the home, because regional center, that's your philosophy to keep families together. Because many times we need really intensive services provided in the home rather than placing the child out into a residential placement. Okay, here's a map. I don't know if you can see it, but that's how the 21 regional centers are divided up. There's 7 just in the Los Angeles area. Some of them are huge, some of them are small. The Alta, the one I ran, we were about 3rd largest. The largest is down in Inland County. The regional centers differ, and that was by design. The services that will be provided in downtown Los Angeles are going to look a whole lot different than in Inyo and Mono County. For one thing, if you're a vendor, which I described a moment ago, you need a critical mass of people to be referred to you to economically be able to run your business. And in some of those less populated counties, there just aren't enough. So sometimes you see a little bit more flexibility in some of those counties where they'll do more things like personal assistance, or they'll be a little more creative because they don't have the vendors to be able to provide the service. Now, what happens, of course, is what if you move from one regional center to the other? Under the regulations, the receiving regional center is to, in fact, continue to provide the services that were outlined in the sending regional center's IPP. IPP, by the way, is Individual Program Plan. That's like the IEP of special education. So the receiving regional center is to keep the or put into place the same services that were in the sending regional center's IPP to the extent that they can. Now, they may not have the vendors available that the sending regional center, but to the degree, until that receiving regional center conducts and holds a new IPP meeting. So just something to think about. And by the way, transfers between regional centers really take a long time. And people wonder, why the heck does it take so long? Well, it's bureaucracy at its best. Just a small snippet. When you have a regional center that's been providing services, they can't transfer that case to another regional center until all the vendors that were providing services in that sending regional center have submitted their bills, the bills have been paid. The regional center worker has to have a closing summary. It has to go through a transfer intake, all of this logistics of then being sent to the new regional center. So I know sometimes a lot of the families I work with are just really frustrated at how long it takes, because they've moved, they've moved to a new county and they're not getting the services because the case hasn't transferred yet. So we really stay on those transfer secretaries, and I get as involved as necessary to keep those things moving along. Okay, let's talk about eligibility. Eligibility is determined solely on meeting the definition of developmental disabilities. Before, we had talked about benefits that are means tested. Regional center eligibility is not means tested. However, there's a caveat to that we'll get to, that there's been somewhat of a slow erosion of the Landerman entitlement over the years by imposing fees on families. And we'll get to those, and we'll also get to how you can avoid those fees. Program is unique to California. As Steve said, you go to other states, you're on waiting lists. And the waiting lists that you're on are to get onto the Medicaid waiver programs, because that's how a lot of the states fund their services for the developmentally disabled. In California, if your child is on the waiver, on the what's called the Department of Developmental Services waiver, or not, you get the same services. It's just a way for the state to get more money. So I know a lot of families, they're presented with a document by the regional center that's what's called a Medicaid waiver choice document. And they say, Jim, should I sign this or shouldn't I? Or what's going to change? If I don't sign it, is my child not going to get this services? No, it has no effect on the services that the child is going to receive. It's just a way for the state to get more money. In other states, it's the difference between being served and not served. But in California, that's not the case. Okay, regional centers administer two programs. First of all, how many folks in here, by a show of hands, are involved with the regional center? Whoa, cool, that's great. Okay, talking to a good audience. Okay, they administer two programs, as you're probably aware. The regional centers administer the 0 to 3 program, called the Early Start Program, Early Intervention Program, has a much broader definition of eligibility, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then there's the Over 3 program. Sometimes parents don't even realize that there's an Over 3 program because the regional center has not found their child to be eligible for Over 3 services, and they just hand the child off to education. And I'll meet with families and they'll say, geez, we thought regional center was only 0 to 3. No, your child was not found eligible for Over 3 services, and you should have challenged that, and maybe we can still challenge that. Okay, so let's talk about the early intervention. This definition for early intervention services, like I said, is much, much broader. It basically is children younger than 3 years with exceptional needs who are at risk of becoming in other words, meeting the definition of developmental disabilities, or who have a developmental delay may be qualified for services. With the regional center I ran, only about a third of the families, a third of the children who were in the Early Start program went on to be in the Over 3 program. 2/3 of them did not. That's good and bad news. I mean, the good news is we provided them very intensive in-home OT, PT, speech, infant development, infant stimulation services that caused them to not meet the definition of being developmentally disabled. The bad news is that that child is not going to receive regional center services for the rest of their life, most likely, unless we go back to the regional center and try to establish eligibility. And the regional center, as I like to say, really is the golden ticket in terms of benefits for folks with developmental disabilities, including, of course, autism. Early intervention services are based on the child's assessed developmental needs, and again, OT, PT, speech. Now, for the over 3 services, this is where the Landerman Act, the developmental disabilities definition kicks in. It's usually determined just prior to the child turning 3. The developmental disability must have occurred prior to the age of 18. Now, applying for services to the regional center doesn't have to occur prior to 18. I mean, we used to have, the horror stories of finding somebody who's been, kept in the back room by their family and they're 50 and 60 years old. We would sometimes be able to make that person eligible because we could document that they were, in fact, developmentally disabled through family history or through some sorts of records, that they were, in fact, years ago, developmentally disabled prior to the age of 18. So you don't have to apply prior to 18, but you have to be documented that you were developmentally disabled prior to the age of 18. The developmental disabilities must be expected to continue indefinitely and constitutes a substantial disability for the individual. Now, this is part of the definition that families sometimes don't understand. Okay, so the definition of developmental disability right now, because it's changed, the terminology has changed, it includes intellectual disability, that used to be called mental retardation, cerebral palsy, seizure disorder or epilepsy, autism, or the famous what we call the 5th category, a disabling condition closely related to an intellectual disability or requiring treatment similar to that required for individuals with an intellectual disability. It's a real sort of fuzzy 5th category, we call that. So you could have someone with let's say a seizure disorder, and you'll see in a moment that doesn't necessarily mean that or even with autism, well, with autism it's usually pretty clear cut, but the disability must result in being substantially disabled, and we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, this is important to know because I many times have families come to me and they wonder why can't they apply for regional center. If their child has a learning disability, mental health, or is solely physical in nature, those are not qualifying conditions for regional center. Now, the person could have one of those disabilities plus a developmental disability. We call them duly diagnosed. But let's take mental health. With mental health, it gets a little fuzzy because, okay, mental health isn't a qualifying condition, but maybe you give that person an IQ test and they score below 70, which is qualifying. Regional centers will many times say, well, that IQ is suppressed because of the mental health overlay, not because of a true developmental disability. So it gets sort of fuzzy. Okay, this is where there's the other part of the definition. So we talked about, the qualifying conditions. But that qualifying condition must result in a significant functional limitation in 3 or more of the following. Now, this would apply to adults. For children, there's really only 5 areas. So there must be documentation that the person's disability results in functional limitation in 3 of these areas. And there really is not a whole lot of definition in the regulation defining each of these. So the interdisciplinary teams at each of the regional centers has to make a determination as to whether the disability has in fact limited the person in self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, primarily for physically disabled, self-direction, now the last 2 are just for adults, capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. So if you have a child, they're going to have to meet 3 of the first 5 dots. Now when I first began running a regional center, this wasn't in the law. It didn't have the 3 or more. So you had some regional centers that were making people eligible that had only 2 or had to have 5, and so it was a real mess. And so they finally cleaned it up with having 3. Okay, regional centers' responsibilities. I think I already talked about the first bullet, that they don't provide direct service, they use vendors. The next bullet is really an important bullet. regional centers, as most agencies like to say, are payers of last resort. So you're going to run into regional centers wanting to have copies of denials of everything. Medi-Cal denials, denials from private health insurance, denials from, whatever agencies, other school districts or whatever, before the regional center. Now, as a bit of a caveat, and we've been talking somewhat about special needs trusts, we've had some interesting experiences with the regional centers and special needs trusts. We had a regional center that said, no, we're not going to pay for respite because this child has a special needs trust. And we said, yes, they should pay for it. And we went through the appeals process, which I'll describe pretty soon, and we went all the way up to an administrative law judge, and we got a great decision from that judge. And that was that while regional centers are payers of last resort, that only applies to other public agencies. And had the legislature intended that it would apply to special needs trusts, they would have specifically said that. Now, ALJ decisions, as some of you probably know, are not precedent-setting. And so we could have regional centers that would challenge that again. But when I'm working with families and we have regional centers say, oh, there's a special needs trust, we're not going to provide, they sometimes will say, we're not going to provide anything because there's a special need. I'll drag out that ALJ decision, make sure at least the supervisor or the administrator sees it, and we usually can push back on that. We've not had any regional center take that all the way up to an ALJ since that first decision, which is great. We also had IHSS do that, by the way. IHSS said the same thing. We went all the way up to an ALJ and we prevailed. So we've got that decision that we can show because IHSS was saying that the special needs trust should pay for that before they did. Okay, moving on. Okay, the IPP. All services are defined through the IPP process. And when you talk about the entitlement, I mean, when my brother-in-law, Chuck, would have an IPP, and my wife and her sisters would say, Jim, where's the list? Where's the menu of all the services that regional centers can provide? I know you all ask for that. And occasionally you can sort of find it. If you Google enough regional center sites, websites, you sometimes find a list. But the entitlement really is based upon what's in the IPP for that child or that adult. That's the entitlement. And it's not an entitlement until both sides agree, until the regional center has agreed that that is a needed service. And we'll get into a little bit later, all services are based upon assessed need. So the entitlement really is, what are the services that have been determined through an assessment that your child, adult child, minor child, needs, and that the regional center has agreed to provide. That's the entitlement. Again, philosophy is to provide services that will allow a consumer's life to approximate that of his or her same age non-disabled peers. And I think I talked about before, the services can differ from one regional center to another. Okay, the IPP planning team. It really only needs to be 2 people, technically. If it's a child, it's the parent and a representative from the regional center. If it's an adult, it's the consumer and a representative from the regional center or that adult's conservator. When I was an executive director, I sat in on occasionally IPP meetings that we had, like 15 people. Because you can invite whoever you want, and that's really important because that IPP meeting is a time to really take a good assessment of your child's needs, and you need to have the people at that meeting who can express that to the regional center and to the team. So you can have anyone you want there. You can have other family members, friends, neighbors, coworkers, service providers, anyone that you would like to have there. Okay, the required components of an IPP. As I said before, assessment is really, really important. I have parents that will say, we really need ILS, independent living skills training. And I'm just beginning to work with the family, let's say, and I'll say, well, did you ever ask for an assessment? No. Well, if you don't have that assessment, you're not going to get off square one. So it's similar to the IEP process where you have an IPP assessment plan that you sign off on. You agree that all these assessments are going to be done. That's really what you need to do with the regional center, is you need to identify what the need is, but then get an assessment. Because if you've got that assessment, you've got a good argument for that service being needed. And also, if we take it up to appeal, we're going to need to have that. And similar to an IEP, the IPP breaks it down into goals and objectives, and then the services and supports to achieve those goals, whether by the regional center or not. I had an interesting case where the regional center, I won't say which regional center, was denying supported living services 24/7, okay? They didn't want to pay for it. And this young lady had seizures. And there was a concern and past experience that when she was showering, she could have a seizure and fall and hurt herself. Well, it was interesting. We took it all the way up to mediation, which is the second level. And the regional center agreed that, that she needed that, but they said the family should provide it. And so I said to them, I said, well, that's very interesting. So you're agreeing that she needs it, and you're saying the family and natural support should provide it, but the family's saying they can't. And so that means that you pay for it. And it was interesting because the regional center representative said, you know, Jim, you know too much. Because and so it was agreed to. I mean, because the regional center agreed that this person needed 24/7. And as soon as we exhausted that there was not a natural support to support, they were on the hook to pay for it. So that was great. Okay, so some regional centers, interestingly enough, calls the 0 to 3 plans IFSPs, and some of them call them IPPs. So it gets sort of confusing. And some of the regional centers, Harbor Regional Centers, in fact, calls even the over 3 plans IFSPs. It's developed again let me define this slide a little bit better. The IPP is the overall goals and objectives, and it's determined how those goals and objectives are going to be achieved, and that's through a vendor. Now, at the vendor level, you then have another plan called the individual service plan. And so I'll many times have parents that say, you know, we need to get in all of this stuff about Johnny. Johnny needs this and Johnny needs that into the IPP. And I said, no, we don't. We need to get the goal and objective in there. But how it's actually provided and how his needs are going to be met at the ground level, that needs to go into the individual service plan. And that's developed with the vendor themselves. So there's a difference between those. Okay, let's get into some of these fees that the regional center has begun to charge. Over the years, there's 3 that have come into effect. How many of you pay any kind of fees for regional center services? A few. That's great. Okay. There's the Family Cost Participation Program, there's the Annual Family Program fee, and there's a Parental Financial Responsibility Program. We'll go through each of them. Now, this is just for children. The Family Cost Participation Program, that came into existence shortly before I left the regional center. They said, okay, we've got services that we really think that the family should help pay for part of it. And it was daycare, respite, and recreational services. It was camp, in fact, at that time. But then camp, all social activities were suspended, and it's been suspended for like 15 years now, I think, that regional centers would pay for. But they said, okay, if the child is involved in daycare or respite, and is 0 to 17 and not eligible for Medi-Cal, and that's going to be important. We're going to get to that. The family is going to be assessed a fee or a cost, and the way they do this is interesting. If let's say through the IPP process we determine, let's just use easy numbers, that there's 10 hours of respite that are necessary. Let's say the family has an income of $97,000. The regional center is only going to pay for 9 of those 10 hours because the family needs to pick up 10%. The regional center is not going to collect the money from the family. They're not going to require that the family pay the respite agency, but they're just not going to pay for all 10 hours because given the family's income, the family should be picking up 10% of the cost. Now, that's really counterintuitive to meeting the needs of the consumer because we've identified that consumer needs 10 hours, and yet what if the parents don't pay for that? The service is not going to be provided. But you can see incomes over 243, regional center is not going to pay for any child care or any respite unless the child's on Medi-Cal. There's the annual family program fee. Again, children 0 to 18. Example, under 97,000, 0, but if you're over 200,000, you're assessed a $200 fee. I had a family the other day that had a letter from the regional center. It was basically saying that they were going to start garnishing the state income tax refunds because they hadn't paid their fee. So they're serious about this. Again, no fee if the child's on Medi-Cal. And then the last one is the Parental Family Responsibility Program. There comes a time when children have to be placed out of their home for whatever reason. The regional center and the family have tried everything they can to support the child, keep the child with the family, but the child is placed into 24-hour out-of-home placement. The parents do have a responsibility to pay for a portion of that. And that's even if the child's on Medi-Cal, okay? So if your child is placed into an out-of placement, and this is how it works. A little bit different, annual gross income up to 141, you'd pay $709. That's what they've determined is your portion of the fees for out-of-home placement for a child, okay? An adult consumer is not responsible to pay for anything, except, as I said before, they tried to come after the Special Needs Trust, and we got the ALJ decision. Okay, here's sort of the neat thing. If your child is not eligible for SSI because of your income and your resources, because as you know, those are deemed to the child, that means that your child is not eligible for what's called SSI-linked Medi-Cal. We want the child to be on Medi-Cal for a number of reasons. One is to avoid those fees I just talked about, but the other is for in-home support services. How many of you take advantage of IHSS? Yeah, about a third. If you don't have Medi-Cal, you don't have IHSS, but if your household income is too high, you can't get Medi-Cal by having the child on SSI. So what do? We use a process called institutional deeming. That's if your child is a regional center consumer, age 3 to 18. And it has to be age 3. So a child at 1 or 2, we can't do institutional deeming. They have to move to what's called status 2, which is eligibility for over 3 services. And the regional center has to be paying for at least 1 service. Okay, so they have to be a regional center client. They have to be 3 to 18. Regional center has to be actually paying for a service, not just that the respite was authorized, but that the respite's being used. The regional center then they do an assessment to see if that child has certain deficits. I won't go into all the details of that. But then the child is placed onto the Department of Developmental Services Medicaid waiver. That's what I was talking about before. It really means nothing. You sign the document, the state gets more money. But in this case, it means something because then the regional center sends a letter to the local county Medi-Cal agency and says, please institutionally deem this child on the Medi-Cal by only looking at the child's income and resources, not the parents. And in that process, the local county Medi-Cal agency will look at the Special Needs Trust, but again, they should not count that as the child's resource. So it's a really, really cool way of keeping children, regional center children, on Medi-Cal when they can't get it because they're not qualified for SSI. Okay? Let's get into some of the regional center services. Again, based upon assessed need, not a menu. First of all, residential living options. This is primarily for adults, although children can be placed into homes. We had, when I was running a regional center, we had about 300 residential homes. Very few homes for children, though. So it's pretty unusual to place a child, but it can be done. But mostly the residential placements are for adults. You have your typical board and care home. Community care licensed, 4 to 6 beds, probably sharing a room with another consumer. Regional center, that was one of our biggest ticket items in terms of our budget. When an adult is put into a board and care home by the regional center, that regional center consumer's SSI check goes to the operator of the home. It's about $1,100. And then the regional center picks up the balance, which is huge, $4,000 to $5,000 a month. For as long as that adult is living in that board and care home, the regional center is paying for. And those are big bucks. So again, about the SSI check goes the SSI check goes to the operator, or the SSDI check, and then the regional center picks up the balance. And those board and care homes can range from level 2, which is just minimal supervision, all the way up to the highest level homes we placed in were what's called level 4Is, and those are behavioral homes. So those homes have richer staffing ratios and they have behavioral consultants, but those would be more expensive homes. But again, the regional center makes up the difference between the benefit that the adult's on and what the cost is. Intermediate care facilities for the developmentally disabled, those are Medi-Cal funded, but those are for consumers that have medical needs. So regional center doesn't pay for those. Now we get into some interesting ones here. Supported living services, SLS. I don't know, how many folks have heard about SLS? Okay, good. It's what I call the Cadillac of the services. It's a service that regional centers aren't always real wanting to share with families. It's very expensive. It can range, well, basically what it is the consumer living in their own home. The regional center is not going to pay for the home. They're not going to, except under extremely exceptional circumstances. I think it had to be approved by the executive director. I think there was one family in 10 years that we had to do that. But they're not going to pay for the rent. They're not going to pay the mortgage. So the family is going to have a home. Is going to have a condo or an apartment or something for the adult consumer to live in, and maybe live with another consumer, okay? The regional center is then going to provide the staffing that's necessary from an SLS agency to allow that individual to remain living independently. Now, when I was at the regional center, we had about 250 people on SLS. Our Alta Regional Center was one of the first regional centers to pilot SLS when it was a federal program years and years ago. And I wasn't there at the time, but they literally put everybody's name in a hat that wanted SLS, no matter how disabled they were, and they pulled them out. And some of the names that they pulled out were people that were medically fragile. They were hooked up to all sorts of technology. They were on gurneys, and the regional center provided them 24/7. So our regional center became sort of the benchmark for providing SLS to any level of consumer. We had consumers with autism that needed 24/7, 2-on-1, and we provided that. My brother-in-law, Chuck, he remained living in my wife's parents' home when they passed away, and Chuck just needed the SLS worker to come in the morning, make sure he got up, got dressed, off to the bus to his job, and then when he came back home, the SLS worker would be there, make sure he cooked a good meal, got his clothes laid out for the next day. So he didn't need 24/7, and he needed just those hours that he received. So it's all based upon assessed need. Again, an SLS assessment would be made. But SLS is good and bad. I always counsel parents, though, it's very socially isolating. In a board and care home, which I know many people have very negative, there's good board and care homes and bad board and care homes. But there's a lot of social interaction. You know, some of the board and care things are doing more activities than my wife and I do. You know, they're off to ball games, and they're off to museums, and they're off to, you know, movies, and they're just always active, and they're socially interacting with each other. Supported living is socially isolating because unless there's a roommate, that consumer is really interacting with the adult staff from the SLS agency. Now, it's true they could be going to the adult day program, and they would get that interaction. Now, there's sometimes when it's interesting, SLS is a real flexible service. Let's say that your severely autistic child can't fit in or doesn't, for whatever reason, their needs can't be met in the adult day programs that the regional center is offering or has available. The day activity for that child can be wrapped into the SLS. So instead of SLS just being provided in the mornings and the afternoon and the child going off to the adult day program, the SLS staff could actually be with them all day long. And it could be customized to be, well, that person's activity is to go out and you know, do volunteer work or go, you know, whatever it is. But the SLS staff would be responsible for that adult day program component and be wrapped into the SLS. Family home agency, foster family agency. The foster family agency is for children. Family home agency is a service that is available in some regional centers. It's interesting, that's where a couple has agreed to accept a developmentally disabled person into their home. They're not licensed. The family home agency is licensed. The family home agency is vendorized by the regional center and receives a fee. And then the family home agency pays that couple to have a consumer living with them. So it's sort of like living with, the aunt and uncle or something. It's not real readily available in all regional center areas, but it was an attempt, again, to try to offer a service that was very normalizing, that this individual, for whatever reason, can't remain living with their own family, but could remain living with another couple. Independent living skills is sort of the other side of the coin to supported living services. With supported, well, let me talk about independent living skills training. With independent living skills training, an assessment is made of what skills does your autistic child need in order to possibly live independently. Once that's identified, then the regional center will pay an agency to train them on those skills. If they can learn the skills, great, they can live independently. But if they can't, then that's when SLS kicks in. And SLS is to provide those services that the consumer can't learn, and it's lifelong, so it can go on forever. Okay, other regional center services. In-home respite, I think most of you are familiar with that. Right now, regulations are 90 hours per quarter is the maximum. 30 hours per month is what it breaks down to. I sometimes work with families, and they say, oh, yeah, I'm getting the maximum. And I say, how much are you getting? Well, I'm getting 12. I'll say, no, you're not getting the maximum. But unfortunately, that's, the regional centers have to be, conservative because of their budget constraints in offering. But if the family needs more than the 12, or even actually more than the 30, and there are exceptions that can be made to the number of hours of respite, particularly if that child maybe is going to need to be placed into a 24-hour out-of-home care home, they can exceed the 90 hours per quarter, and that's the leverage we usually use. I'll say, regional center, we need that, or we're going to be talking to you about out-of-home placement, and then we can many times get more than the 90 per quarter. Transportation services regional centers pay for, that's back and forth to day programs. They, of course, pay for a whole variety of adult day program services. Supported employment, this is sort of a cool one, but again, it might not apply to all of the consumers that you have, and particularly for the more severely challenged with autism. But supported employment is a cooperative agreement with the Department of Rehabilitation. So try follow this. The referral is made to the Department of Rehabilitation. Department of Rehabilitation opens the case on your adult consumer, finds them eligible, and then comes up with a vocational goal. Let's say it's food service. And the regional center, the Department of Rehabilitation then pays a supported employment agency to find that job for the person and to pay for a job coach. Now, my brother-in-law, Chuck, that's what he did. He worked at the Carlsbad Military Academy. Marriott was doing the food service, so Chuck got himself a job, and he had a job coach that would come there. And at first, the job coach was with him every single day to make sure he did the job, and then that job coach was weaned away. Well, if the job coach can't be weaned away totally, then the funding for that job coach transitions from the Department of Rehabilitation over to the regional center, and then that job coach can be paid for by the regional center for the rest of that consumer's life. So it's really, really cool. Behavioral services, this I know is a big one for folks with autism. As you probably know, the regulations have changed that you must tap into your own private health insurance and exhaust that before the regional center will consider paying for behavioral services. Intensive behavioral services are really key to a lot of a lot of your family members. The schools are doing some of it, but they're certainly not doing the intensive programs in the home that the regional centers have done in the past, and can still do, but you do have to exhaust your private health insurance behavioral. And I don't know the extent to which that's really occurring. I mean, I think it's a real mixed bag as to what the private health insurance are going to do. I know Kaiser has set up some, autism services and departments for behavioral services, but I don't think it matches what the regional centers have been able to do in the past with discrete trial training and that sort of thing. But you do have to go through the behavioral services that are available through your private health insurance before you can get it from the regional center. Now, once again, it's based upon assessed need. So we have to get a good behavioral assessment. And we have to show that that behavioral assessment is going to identify behaviors that can be treated by a behavioral consultant. Now, with behavioral services, the regional center, many times, they have a parent training model. In other words, they'll have someone come in, they'll do the behavioral assessment, they'll identify what the target behaviors are and what the plan is to address those behaviors. They'll have the parents go through behavior modification training classes, and then they'll have the parents trained by the behavior modification or the behavioralist on how to implement the plan, rather than the regional center actually providing the staff to implement the plan. The thought there is that it should be provided by whoever is closest to what the natural environment is, which is the parents at home and then the school, of course. So many times what the regional center is paying for is this train the parent type of model rather than the tutor model where there's actual tutors that are paid to come into the home to provide the service. Okay, little bit about due process. I'm a great believer in getting things resolved at the lowest level. Lowest level is IPP. How many times have families contact me and say, Jim, we're just not getting it, we're going to appeal. And I'll go, whoa, let's wait. Let's call for another IPP meeting. Let them know that you've got a former executive director of a regional center with you now. They'll bring their supervisor, which is great because the supervisor is going to have more authority to say yes to things. And we gather again at the IPP level because it just takes a lot of time and energy and money to begin that due process. So if we can, to go through those steps. So if we can get it resolved at the IPP level, that's always the preferred way to go. Next step is mediation, similar to what I was just talking about before. Mediation is done with the facilitation of an administrative law judge, the same administrative law judges that conduct the formal fair hearings, but their role is very different. They're trying to facilitate, they sort of do shuttle diplomacy. They put you in one room, put the other, the regional center in the other room, the shuttle back. They'll agree to this if you'll agree to that. And they try to come up with a resolution, but it's non-binding and it's voluntary. So either party can say we're not going to do mediation right off the get-go, but even if mediation does occur, either party can say at the end of it, never mind, we'll see you in front of the judge. And that's of course what the next level is administrative law judge. Now I've had regional centers say to me, Jim, we're not going to resolve this at IPP, but if you take us to mediation, we probably can come up with something, and it's going to be a confidential. I go, great, that's fine. We're happy to do that, and we did it and got it done. So, okay, I think that's it. I don't know how much time I've got, but a lot of time still? Okay.
So we have actually more than half an hour for Q&A. So this is your golden, you don't even have to pay him. So please line up, and I'll have Jim manage.
Sure.
I might kind of push him on timing though, so that we can get to as many questions as we can. Okay? Is that all right? All right.
Okay, starting over here.
So consumers that are on Medi-Cal can get ABA services up until the age 21, paid through Medi-Cal. So then will the regional center kick in after age 21 to provide those services?
The regional center usually takes the position that the time that the child best benefits from those types of strategies are when they're a child. So you won't get, I don't think I've ever seen the regional center do behavior, like the discrete trial training. They'll do behavioral services like I described, where they come in and train the parents, and then, but as far as more individualized, no, not for adults.
And what about the independent living skills training? Will they give that training if the child is already also getting like an ABA service funded by their insurance company?
Good question. Independent living skills training is for adults because it's training them to gain the skills they need to go out and live independently. So no, they won't do it for a child.
But insurance is paying for adults to get ABA services right now. So if they are an adult like 18 or 19 and are getting ABA through the insurance company,
right,
will the regional center still pay for independent living skills, or will they consider that a duplication of service?
Well, it depends upon what the ABA for the private health insurance is doing. If they're doing, have you seen that the private health insurance really does the independent living skills that much?
Well, it depends on what the goals are. I'm actually,
Yeah. Oh, you do
yes,
that?
I work for Kaiser. So.
Oh, okay. Oh, very good. Very
and
good.
we have a lot of adults in programs that are 20 and 30 hours a week. and they're covering a lot.
Well,
of
I think the
independent
answer to your
preschool
question is
services.
probably what you're seeing, and that is that the regional center is going to, their payer of last resort. They're going to turn to you guys, and if you provide it,
Until age 26, and then they're off their parents' insurance, so.
that's right.
So then they would kick in at that point?
Yeah, if that's what's determined through the IPP process, yeah.
Okay, thank
yeah.
you.
You folks may want to talk to her if you have Kaiser Insurance.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, am I cutting you off? I just figured we'll go
No,
south.
go ahead.
No, you're
Hi.
absolutely right.
Oh, you're right.
See you.
I didn't mean to shout. There seems to be a lot of confusion about IHSS benefits crossing over and negating regional center benefits. And I hear different answers all the time.
Yeah.
So if your child is receiving the maximum number of hours, let's say of 283 a
Right.
month, does that compromise the child's eligibility for any kind of
Good
regional
question.
center benefits?
Good question. And the specific service that it many times would affect is respite.
Right.
What I say to families, and we sometimes have to push back on the regional center, is that the parent has the choice to be the IHSS worker or not. If they're the IHSS worker, it's not respite for them.
Yeah.
Regional center is doing their job by saying, well, wait a minute, if the neighbor down the street is providing your child IHSS, and during that time you can go out and do things, you're getting respite, and that's legitimate. Regional center can say that. But if the parent is the IHSS worker, no, we need respite also.
What about if you're already receiving overnight behavioral respite through a different person who comes to the house in addition to the 283 hours of IHSS?
Do you mean the regional center is paying for that overnight?
Yes, overnight behavioral respite, 5 nights a week.
And you're wondering if what?
If the child can continue to, or we can continue to receive the maximum number of
IHSS
IHSS hours.
Yeah, well.
If you break down the hours,
Yeah.
then the
There's
hours,
still
it's
enough
fine.
in the 24 hours.
Yes.
That's the argument you'd have to make.
Right.
That the IHSS is not going to be provided during that overnight time that regional center is paying for.
Sure.
It's the other hours. Of course, IHSS is going to look at what's called alternate resources, and that's like when they're in school or somewhere else.
Sure,
But
they're
you
gonna
have to
get-
come up with a calendar that shows that all those
You
hours.
just have to map it all out
Yep.
very, very specifically.
Exactly.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about housing. You had said that they would pay for certain types of housing. There was a list.
Board and care.
Yeah. I mean, my question is, my son is in a program that it's called CIP, College Internship Program, and it's they provide a lot of living skills, and they pay for the living skills
right.
program, but the housing is not covered at all, and it's quite expensive. And I'm just wondering why, where, like, how did they determine what kinds of housing they'll cover and not? Why do they cover some and not
Well, it's
others?
the board. Yeah, they
Because
pay for.
his program is comprehensive, and he can't do the program without live the living piece, and he is learning to live on his own.
How old is he?
He's 21.
And does he get SSI?
Yes.
And does the SSI go towards that?
Yeah, but it's not. It's a joke.
Not enough. I know. But they
even.
would say, again, turning to, their payer of last resort, they'd say, well, the SSI needs to pay for that, but they don't pay for room and board at a situation like that. Although in some of those CIP kinds of programs, I have seen where it's all wrapped together into one package.
Well, like Taft.
Exactly.
And the rent is much cheaper.
Right.
Right.
But no, they don't pay for housing per se, except board and care.
Well, there was a list.
On my slide?
Yes,
Yeah,
there were several.
but that was independent living and family home agencies and things like that. But the SSI, the individual's SSI check has to go towards paying for that.
Yes. Okay. It's just it's you can't live like here on an SSI check.
I know, talk to your congressman,
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
like
you.
Steve said.
Okay, yeah.
Hello. My question has to do with the Special Needs Trust and regional centers wanting to dip into that for special services. Can you give me a citation for the case that you mentioned where you were successful?
There was no citation, there was the administrative law judge's decision, which was really well written, and he referred to a number of attorney general prior decisions. I think the best thing to do would be, maybe I can somehow forward that on, and we could share that with
I
everybody.
could put it on the webpage for this
Yeah,
session.
just
That
remind
would
me.
be wonderful.
Yeah,
I
it's
really appreciate that.
good.
Thank you.
It also, interestingly enough, it brought up another issue in the same case, and that was that the regional centers will make up stuff, I hate to say. And in particular, they make this one up. They will say that in turning to natural supports, they will say that if this child needs respite, and let's say the grandmother's living in the home, they won't pay that grandmother because they'll say that grandmother's a natural support. The grandmother's maybe been doing it. We went in front of the ALJ and said, you know, grandma's not going to do it anymore. And therefore, but the regional center says, yeah, but it's a natural support. The judge ruled in our favor again, stating that the regional center was making this up. That was not in regulation. And that they would have to pay the grandmother even though she was residing. I had another one where a teenage daughter, she was 19, you have to be over 18 to provide, they weren't going to pay the adult daughter who lived in the home, but I showed them that decision and they changed their mind. So,
I think it's Feda.
here.
Hi, this is kind of a piggyback on Kate's question about the IHSS and the respite. So for example, if you have a letter from a doctor saying there's an additional need for respite than the 30-hour maximum that the regional center is providing, and you're also getting the maximum IHSS hours, it's not all 283, but it's not all protective supervision. So there's some time for task breakdown and there's some protective supervision.
Right.
And the regional center always asks, you know, give us your hours. You know what I mean?
What do you mean by give us your hours?
We want to see exactly how many hours you have of IHSS.
And how it's being used.
And how it's being
Right.
used. And you're not the parent provider. You know, IHSS is a completely different service than respite. And even if you're not the parent provider, that doesn't mean you're getting respite from it.
Right, and that's sort of dovetails off the other question. So we would have to show that, in fact, the regional center is incorrect if they're saying that IHSS is respite for you.
Like, I get that my son is being cared for by somebody else, but I have other kids and I still have to shuttle them around and do
Well,
other things.
no, they would make the argument that you are getting a break from caring. Unfortunately, they don't care about the other kids that you have to care for, but they would say you're getting a break from caring for that disabled child during the time that IHSS is being provided by someone else. So yeah, they would count that.
Well, then what would be a good argument against that?
I'm not sure there is one, because that IHSS is giving you the break. Someone else providing the IHSS. Now, maybe there's not enough hour, but it's 283, so, yeah, they would say that you are getting your respite.
Well, what if the sucker wakes up in the middle of the night?
If what?
If the kid wakes up in the middle of the night?
Well, 283, as you can do the math, is not 24/7.
It's not 24/7. Okay,
Yeah,
very good.
yeah.
My kid wakes up in the middle of the night.
Denise.
Hi.
Yes.
My daughter actually turned 22 yesterday, and we have an IPP scheduled for next week. I've been pretty good with IEPs, knowing what to ask, knowing how to set things up, but I'm completely lost for this IPP. We do have a program set up, and looks like it's going to be okay. Are there any sort of general things that I should be looking at? And
Well,
she does need a lot of services. by the
Hopefully,
way.
there's been, under education law, there's supposed to be a transition plan. So you should already have a pretty good, and the regional center workers should have been coming to some of those IEP meetings and talking about what's going to happen after she leaves,
That's
after
going to be
she.
on Wednesday.
But, well, okay, so none
Yeah,
of,
no.
none of that discussion has been occurring? You're
Not,
starting from ground zero as to what the regional center can do for you?
well, the IPPs, I guess I've been neglecting because the IEP was so strong. So, just.
The transition plan was not really addressed, in other words.
So, no, this is our first meeting on the 7th for the transition plan. We're late, but this is where we are.
Oh, so that's an IEP for the transition, or is it an IPP with the regional center?
They're going to be there.
Who's going to be there?
That's why I answered that way. Everyone, the school, the social worker,
Okay.
the new program.
And it's an IPP meeting?
IPP
Correct.
meeting.
Yeah.
I get
Well, again, the general kind of stuff is everything's based upon assessed need. What are the goals and objectives? Are you wanting, is it your son or daughter?
Daughter.
Are there goals to move out, to remain in your home, to get a job, to do a day activity,
Okay.
all of those kinds of things that are possible, you need to identify and then do an assessment to determine what's going to be needed to get to that goal.
And should these assessments be private, or are these assessments that the?
Oh, they pay for them.
They pay for them, but would you recommend a private one that's not paid by the regional center?
Well, if you're going to, I would first of all go the route with having them do it. I mean,
Okay.
if you get into a contentious situation where they're not going to either do it or you don't agree with the one that they did, then yes, you'd want to get your own private one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to try to speed this up. Okay, speed questions.
Sorry.
Speed question, sorry. My son is 9 years old and severely autistic, and I have no services from our regional center. I tried to get him institutionally deemed and failed at that, and because we were receiving no services, so you have to have those 3 services, or one of the 3 services to get the institutional deeming. I tried to get respite care, and our income is above the respite care eligibility.
Right.
So we couldn't get respite care at all. So what can I get from the regional center?
Yeah, for school-aged children, the regional center services really kick in when the child becomes an adult.
Right.
But while they're 0 to 3, of course, there's intensive services, but it's during those school years that the services that families mainly get are respite and behavioral services. That's usually it for school-aged children from the regional center, unless you have an out-of-home placement,
I don't.
for a child.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Connie?
Yes, questions have to do with the SLS and behavioral services. You mentioned that regional centers can provide behavioral services. I'm not talking about ABA, I'm talking about
Right.
behavioral services
Right.
for adults.
Right.
The SLS, what I've heard from regional centers is we do not give behavioral consultation to SLSs. It has to be within their model. Most of them do not have behavioral models. So how do you address, adults with challenging behaviors who are in the SLS when the regional center refuses basically to provide any
Well,
consultation to their staff?
Yeah, we certainly have had behavioral, consumers with behavioral issues placed into SLS, and the SLS agency, if they didn't have it built into their cost breakdown and therefore how they were vendorized, then the regional center would have to come up with a behavioral assessment of behavioral services separate from the SLS.
But they say that can't be done because
Well,
it
it
should be
can't-
within their model. And
No,
if
it
it's
can't
not,
be. It can be done, but they're choosing not to do it, so you may
Okay.
have to appeal
And then
it.
the other question has to do with IHSS and the implications when you do have challenging adults who are maybe getting protective supervision.
Mm-hmm.
The SLS states, we may not want to take that type of a client because we're not paid any overhead for the IHSS hours in terms of the staffing. And I just wondered
I don't know what you mean by the overhead for
In other words,
IHSS.
they're not
The
going to
overtime?
supervise, they're not going to supervise the protective supervision hours. They said, this is something we're not going to pay for. We only supervise or provide money to the SLS for the non-IHSS hours.
The regional center is saying that?
Yeah.
Well, the regional center will only pay the vendor for the SLS hours, and the vendor is required, and the family and the consumer is required to tap into those IHSS hours.
Right.
And usually the IHSS actual worker is usually the same person that works for the SLS agency.
Right, but the SLS agency doesn't want to be working with a family that may have 280 hours. So what I'm seeing, and I'm speaking of more than one SLS agency.
So the regional center ends up having to pay for a whole lot more hours.
But they say no because they said they're, 280.
I would see if you can go to a different SLS agency.
Interesting,
Yeah.
okay.
All right,
Thank you.
moving on.
Okay, this has to do with vendorization.
Yeah.
There is a camp in Los Angeles area that has a vendorization with a regional center. That regional center, our regional center, does not have a contract with that regional center. I understand that, and I understand services can be different. So there's the campers in LA get funded by their regional center, we don't. But
Yeah.
for out-of-home respite, can that vendor provide those services? Because everybody gets out-of-home respite. Do we have to have a specific vendorization with the regional center of the East Bay? Or can the regional center of the East Bay use that vendor's respite?
Good question.
number?
Just the general, I think this will address your question.
Okay.
When a vendor is vendorized, they're vendorized by the state of California. And once vendorized by one regional center, any regional center can tap into that vendor number. Now, regional centers will be hesitant, and they'll do like what they call a courtesy vendorization. But if the regional center, where the vendor resides, has vendorized them, any regional center can use that vendor.
Okay, but if the West Side Regional Center has vendorized with this camp for camping services, can our regional center use them for out-of-home respite?
Only if they're vendorized for out-of-home respite.
So they have to be vendorized?
By each of the service there, yeah. So you'll have a provider that has like 3, ILS, SLS,
Okay.
whatever.
So
they
if they're,
have,
okay, so if they're only vendorized for camping services, we can't use them for out-of-home respite?
right, you have to go to that vendor and say, are you interested in going through the hoops that are necessary to do a program design, everything that's required to become vendorized for that out-of-home
Okay,
respite.
Okay.
moving on.
So, Jim, I have a more general question. So earlier you spoke of the erosion of services for the regional centers. I receive fairly regular emails from my service coordinators to contact my legislators. And so my question to you is, what is your reading of the current state legislative environment? Is the Lanterman Act itself under siege, or are the funds for the under siege?
Well, I think everything's in flux right now. So much of the money, through the Medicaid waiver, about a third of the money that the regional centers receive is from the federal government. And who knows what's going to be happening to the federal dollars. And we have a pretty tight, as Steve was saying, we have a pretty tight governor in terms of expansion. I don't see, there was an incremental increase in the vendor rate for, I think it was a couple of the different programs. It took forever to get implemented. It didn't make any real difference. A couple of cents in the provider's paycheck. So I don't see, as Steve had said, I don't see any huge influx of money. I think it's going to be difficult for them they're not going to wipe out the program, but I think we're going to see this slow erosion. It's, death by 1,000 cuts kind of a thing. And that's I think what we're going to continue to see, and we have to, as advocates, make sure that we don't let that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get to the questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Hi, good morning.
Yes, good morning.
I am a parent of 2 disabled kids, and my question is about respite and IHSS. And I have protective supervision for both of them. I am the provider for both of them. But with the new overtime law that happened in California, they kept me for 360 hours for both of them. That's the cap. So I have more than that. The thing is, my question is, with my protective supervision through in-home support services, I lost my respite hours from NBRC. Why is it that I will not have the respite hours from NBRC, even though I have a protective supervision for my kids? I was reading the nuts and bolts of Disability Rights of California, and it says that in-home support services is provided by the provider to take care of your kids in your home. But respite hours is giving the provider the time to have a break.
Right. I think that's what we were talking about before. But you're saying you are the provider.
I
So
am
it's
the
not. So I would be going back to RCEB or whoever it is and saying, I need this rest.
The service
And that's really
coordinator,
sort of, exactly, the service coordinator.
Well, I spoke to her and she said, well, you're not gonna win, she said, because we have mothers who fight for this and they lose. You're just
Well,
wasting your time.
They're told to say that, so.
So what will I do? I need my respite. I have 2 disabled kids, and I'm going crazy. I need a break.
Sure you do. And that's totally separate from the whole overtime thing.
So-
You are the IHSS provider, you need respite, and I would ask them to put it in writing and tell them you're going to appeal it. And call me if you want to.
Oh, sure. I need your.
Okay, next question, please.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Hi, my son is 33. He's a regional center client.
Speak a little bit more into the mic.
Okay. My son is 33. He's a regional center client. My question relates to what you said, is that regional center is not a menu of services. You have to have it in your IPP. Okay, my son is living at home. He's happy living at home for the, short-term foreseeable future. That's probably going to continue. But my husband and I are both in our mid-60s. My son has no siblings. Eventually, we're going to assume that he'll be in a board and care home or something like that. At our last year's IPP meeting, our case manager said something about, well, where is Christopher going to live, like, after you're gone? As if, like, you know, it was, like, totally on us. And so what I'm trying, because you mentioned the whole idea of assessment, before, you know, we die or we reach that critical mass, is it possible to request a housing assessment, like, for the future? Like, you know, when the family is not around to take care of this person,
Sure.
he's going to need housing?
Yeah, and again, you can put that in the long-range plans of the IPP. And for
Okay.
housing, that probably is a service that there's not necessarily an assessment that's conducted. But we're going to be having another small group breakout, I think, later, that's going to talk about, you know, what do we do after we're gone, and we can
Okay.
address some of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I had a question about the supported living services, which I'd never heard about.
Surprise.
I'm concerned about the oversight. After I'm not here, who's case managing and who's making sure that the caregiver shows up and that my kid's safe?
It's the regional center. They have that responsibility. If somebody, different regional centers are doing it differently, but hopefully at least a quarterly visit to the home to see that the services are being provided. I think this will get, again, into what do we do after we're gone and,
Yeah,
and looking
wait
at
for the next
conservative.
panel.
Yeah.
Okay, and the eligibility has to do with that IPP? That's where all that's talked about?
For SLS?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Everything is at the IPP meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Teresa?
Hi, my daughter is 20 years old and relatively high functioning but cannot live independently, and we do not leave her home alone. I've thought about purchasing a condo and having SLS, but I'm concerned about the social isolation.
Right.
I'm also concerned with being able to oversee the quality of a board and care and whether or not it might go out of business, and then she'd have to move and disrupt her life. She doesn't need a one-on-one aid. Are there any cases when you can share SLS workers with other consumers,
Yeah.
or would I have to open my own board and care to give
Well,
her a community?
On that last
living?
point, I have families that always say, oh, we'll just open our own. Well, they need to look into what community care licensing hurdles they have to jump over.
Right.
But yeah, certainly, and I think I addressed that before, that there is the social isolation
Yes.
with SLS. But yeah, they can have roommates, and many times regional centers almost require that for cost benefit or cost purposes, cost containment, that because then there can be an SLS provider that's working with both consumers, and then they have socialization with and also it helps pay for that condo or whatever it is if you have another parent participating in the cost.
And do you feel like with the new federal regulations about how many people constitute like an institution, that there's no longer going to be able to have like 6 people in a home together? Or
No, I don't think it's going to affect that, as far as I
hope
know.
not.
No.
All right. Carmen.
Yep.
Hi, my son is a regional center client. He has high-functioning autism and learning disabilities, and he's right on the cusp of possibly being able to get a high school diploma, or we're looking at certificate of completion. I'm wondering how that would impact his services in the future.
From regional center?
Yes.
Yeah, once the adult child, because if they're over 18, exits the school system, then they're the responsibility of the regional center. But under W&I code, welfare and institution code, as long as the child is still involved with education, special ed, which can be up until age 22, the regional center cannot pay for adult day programming. The school is responsible. But once the child exits with a diploma or a certificate of completion, then it's the regional center's responsibility.
Is there any advantage either way? Because he's running a lot.
Well, it comes down, it's a very good question, because I work with many families that say, you know, Johnny has done those worksheets so many times, or he's done this so many times. I say, well, go look at what the regional center has to offer. Just look at some of those adult day programs and decide. Maybe it's better to go ahead and exit him at this point.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, next.
Hi, I have a 21-year-old son who has severe autism, and so next year he's exiting the school system, and I've been looking around the adult program. Probably he will go to the day.
Adult day program?
Yeah, adult day center-based, and I'd like to create a hybrid with a self-employment component, but I was told that one program per day, that's what regional center will provide. So if it's not true, then how can I,
Yeah, regional center can't pay two vendors for the same service at the same time, like 2 different adult day programs. But they do have customized day programs. It's sort of a new, look that one up, customized day programs. It allows for real flexibility in what is provided to your adult child during the day.
I did, but the waiting list is too long, so it's not going to be available
There's
for
only,
my son.
yeah, there's only certain vendors that have become, again, vendorized for customized day programs, and yeah, they're starting to have waiting lists. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
These questions are great, by the way. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
they are.
I have a sister who's 56 years old, and she's been in regional center for the last 40 years, in and out of state institutions 40 years ago, so we've gone through a whole process. I want to know if a consumer is eligible for independent living skills as well as in-home service support services as she's aging.
Sure.
You can get
Yeah,
both.
there's two separate things. IHSS is to provide those care needs that she needs to remain living. ILS is to train her on those things that she's going to need to live independently.
Okay, she
So-
currently lives independently.
Okay, is she successful at living independently, or she needs training on some
She
things?
needs more services as she ages.
Oh, well,
as she's-
so I think there, you're probably looking at SLS versus ILS. If she can be trained on those things that she needs to improve on in order to live successfully alone, then it'd be ILS, which is time limited. If she can never learn the skills that she needs to, then SLS would be provided, would kick in and provide that forever.
You mentioned earlier about 283 hours a month.
That's
What's that?
yeah, that's in-home support services, and that's usually when the individual is approved for what's called protective supervision. That's, you've also heard that term a lot. You automatically, if they're determined to be severely impaired, they can get the maximum 283. If it's just moderate, it's 195.
Okay. To get her in-home support services, do I contact the regional center?
No.
And go through the form?
Good question. They have to be on, she would have to be on Medi-Cal first.
Yes, she
and then you
is.
contact the IHSS agency in your county.
Okay.
You can just Google it, and they'll take the application over the phone, then they'll send an assessment. Well, they'll send what's called the healthcare certification form the doctor has to fill out that says if she didn't get these services, she'd have to go into a care facility. And then they'll come out and do an assessment as to how many hours she needs.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay. Hello.
Yes, hi.
I have two questions. One is about Medi-Cal and institutional deeming into Medi-Cal. So my 22-year-old son is working. He is institutionally deemed.
Well, 22 he wouldn't need to be, because
They still did.
there's no reason, because institutional deeming is a process by which only his income and resources are looked at, and once he's over 18, that's all they look at anyway, so.
Okay, so how would his, now the question about his income, he's not saving money, so but his income is, around $1,000.
From what, from where?
From work.
Oh, from work.
He's actually working, has two
Okay.
jobs, yes.
Okay.
And one of his jobs is offering benefits, so he can sign up for medical insurance. So would that cancel Medi-Cal?
He's on Medi-Cal and earning $1,000 a month?
And he's spending it all.
Yeah, they don't care about that, they just look at
Right.
how much he's.
Right.
How is he on Medi-Cal? He's not on SSI, because given that income, unless he's not reporting it, he wouldn't be receiving SSI. He might be getting.
He still is on SSI.
Oh, he is on SSI?
But he's not getting any money from SSI because his income is too high.
So he's in suspend, his SSI is suspended?
No, they haven't suspended it. He owes the money, actually, to pay them back.
Wow, I'm not totally understanding the situation.
It's
Maybe we can
very-
talk
Okay,
afterwards.
yeah, let's
Yes.
skip that. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I'm going to go to another. You already asked a question before, and we have so many other people,
Okay.
so I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Catch me later. Yes.
Hi there. My question has to do with getting back on the regional center list. My son was, right now he's 19, almost 20.
Yeah.
And he is diagnosed with Asperger's, autism, and also he qualified for SSI and IHSS.
Okay.
But what happened when he was 3 years old, he was referred to regional centers. He wasn't talking, or 2 or something, that wasn't talking. And once he started talking, we thought everything was okay. We opted out.
Okay.
And that was a mistake. Now,
Okay.
we're trying to get back on it, and I hear horror stories that you have to hire a lawyer, there's no definition, but he's got seizure disorder.
Okay.
He's got an autoimmune disease, and that's how he qualified for all those services. So my question is it worth my time to pursue that, to
Sure.
get onto regional center?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
how
even,
difficult is it?
even regional centers will admit that at age 3, they have to make a decision. And they are willing to relook at that decision. Maybe it needs to be relooked at age 15 or 20 or 25, whatever. So
Right.
yeah, you reapply.
Okay.
You want to be sure to provide all the medical documentation. Now,
Right.
if there's a seizure disorder and that's affecting in 3 of those 7 areas, then you've got a pretty
Well,
strong case.
he has like 6 of
Yeah,
those 7 areas.
definitely apply.
Okay.
Now, if that occurred prior to the age of 18, if those.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Yes,
good.
yes. Okay, thank you.
Christina.
Hi, I wanted to flag something for you considering your work and then also everyone in the audience. When regional centers are looking at generic resources, if you have able assets, they cannot force you to spend that money, even though, for example, let's say a regional center would purchase, if your child broke their glasses and typically they would buy the glasses, the replacement, they'll sit down with the family and ask them if they have assets to help out with the cost. They can do whatever they normally do, but with respect to California ABLE Act accounts or any ABLE account asset that your child has, they cannot require you to spend the ABLE money.
Is that in regulation or?
It's going to be.
Great.
All right. A state regulation.
Huh.
Hi, I have a 14-year-old son with autism.
Yes.
And I'm going through the regional center process. I just want to know about is he eligible for Medi-Cal? He is on my private insurance. And I also want to know if he is eligible for Medi-Cal, that will pick up all the co-pays from my private insurance, the deductibles.
Okay, he can be on Medi-Cal if we do the institutional deeming, but Medi-Cal is always secondary coverage to the private health insurance he has. But some families look at it and say, okay, well, what doctors can, if he just had Medi-Cal, and can we cancel the private and save the money? If you don't, Medi-Cal will many times pick up the premiums for the private and the co-pays, because it's cheaper for them to do that than to pay for everything.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Hi. So I have a child that requires 24/7 services. The regional center has cobbled together a conglomeration of services, including, get about 300 hours of SLS, another 160 of community integration, about 100 of PA. And
That's personal assistance.
Yeah, and IHSS of 280. Rather than grant them an exemption to the median rate system, we have actually are going back to them to argue that, since his IHSS providers get $11 an hour, and his SLS providers are getting 17, that IHSS is not an appropriate generic resource, even though the SLS provider does supplement the same people are providing IHSS and SLS. Is there an argument that just based on the discrepancy of pay that IHSS is not an appropriate generic resource for him?
Boy, that would go all the way in front of a judge.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, there's nothing in the
We're
regulation.
okay,
I mean,
we're
regional
ready.
center-
We've done that before, so we're ready for that.
Yeah, okay,
actually.
good.
Okay.
Let me know, or let Steve know, we'll help you.
Hey, Linda.
Does a family have any recourse if your adult child's IPP lists very specific services and supports, and you're told by your regional center that they can't find anybody to provide them?
Well, like I said before, regional
It's a
centers
big
are
problem.
dependent upon the vendors, and if they don't, in the old days, 10, 15 years ago, they actually gave us a budget to develop resources that were needed. Those days are gone. We could we could give board and care operators $10,000 or $20,000 for startup, but those days are gone. So the regional center is dependent upon the vendors that are available in the community. All you can do is look at maybe that service could be provided in another way through another type of vendor. But if they don't have any
Or
vendors.
self-determination, maybe down the line.
Someday,
down the
yeah,
line.
when they finally get it, that's right.
So
Self-determination's
there's basically no
coming.
recourse in terms of really a non-compliance issue.
No.
Like
Because they're
there might
willing,
be
because
with IEPs.
because they've approved it, they're willing to pay for it, they just don't have a vendor.
So you're stuck.
Yeah, unless
Okay,
self-determination.
That's a nightmare.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Joanne.
Funny about the self-determination just being brought up. My question is about the board and care facilities and how, kind of my understanding is that the philosophy or the thinking is that we're going to move out of isolated care facilities and try to move more into embedded into a naturalized
Community center.
ratio,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So how is the regional center processing that?
They're not going to do anything until regulations change.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
So my son's 22, and he got a diploma, so he's been with the regional center since he graduated high school. And he's moved last February to, we found an awesome board and care.
Good.
He's young, and so he doesn't know how to manage money at all. The board and care provides a great social environment for him. It's much better than the isolation of just even being in the
Yeah,
family
true.
home.
Right.
But we just had our IPP, and we were asking about, can we get him some independent living skills to help planning money and things. So
They said no.
They said that should be provided in the
By
home.
the board and care home?
That's where we would look to.
All right, time's up, so let's let Jim just answer as much as he
Yeah,
can, and
I
then
don't-
we're going to have to end it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Jim.
Yeah, they're not going to pay for ILS unless you could make an argument that the goal is that he's going to move out of that board and care, move into ILS, then that you could have an argument.
Okay, so when we get closer to that.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to call it quits, and we will be back here.